Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this panel dedicated to high-level diplomacy. My name is Jean-Louis de Brouwer. I'm the director of the European Affairs program of the Egmont Institute, and I will have the privilege to share this 90 or so minutes with you and a very distinguished panel. First of all, a word about the choreography. It might sound a bit complicated, but we'll manage, I'm sure. One of our panelists will join us virtually. It's going to be the first one. It's going to be Stefano Sannino. He's the Secretary General of the European External Action Services. He could not make it with us physically for different reasons, including, of course, a very heavy agenda, but we'll have him with us virtually in the beginning of the meeting. Stefano is already there. Stefano, very nice to meet you. So I will pass you the floor after having introduced the whole session. And if at all possible, maybe we'll address a few questions to you before you leave, so that, we can also, including our panelists, can react on command on what you are going to say. Then I will turn to our panelists, and then we'll open kind of a ministerial segment, because we have, amongst other things, and we thank you very much, Mr. Minister, to be there, the Minister of Montenegro, who is going to share his views about what EU or humanitarian diplomacy in general can be. Then we'll turn to a Q&A session with the audience, either those physically present in this room or those joining up with these wonderful technologies, which is called Slido, and which is completely alien to me, by the way. And then we'll end up with a last round with our panelists. And then, there will be a bit of a housework to be done to you. I will ask you to address recommendation to the EU. At the end of the panel, what kind of takeaways would you like us to bring from this meeting? Let me first start with a few words describing the hurdles I met when preparing this session. As a newcomer to the wonderful world of think tank, I wanted for once to make a somewhat documented presentation. So therefore, I looked for a formal definition of what is meant by humanitarian diplomacy. And I went to, the three formal documents, which are respectively the Commission communication, which is, I would say, the policy framework for this forum, but also the resolutions adopted afterwards by the European Parliament, as well as the conclusions prepared by the Council. And mind you, I did not find this concept present in either of these three papers. Not a word about humanitarian diplomacy. Of course, there were references to something which could sound or look like humanitarian diplomacy, but these references were mainly about IHL, protection of IHL, and protection of IHL in general. Also yesterday and today, I attended, like some of you, a few panels, and humanitarian diplomacy, although not directly mentioned, was a bit of a subtitle in many of these panels. Let me take two examples. The one concerning the engagement with non-state armed group, or the one, and I see is moderator amongst ourselves this afternoon, concerning humanitarian leadership, for instance, although there was no explicit reference to humanitarian diplomacy. So I was left with more questions than answers, but these questions should have been answered. I always remember one of my first boss when entering the world of humanitarian aid, the then Commissioner Kristalina Georgieva, hammering out that humanitarian aid was money and access. So what do they want us, what do they, ECHO, want us to talk about this afternoon? I remember also a conversation with one of our panelists, and I will not name him or her, when preparing this panel session, and he said something which still resonates with me. It's going to be a very difficult panel to handle, because at the end we are going to be all outside our zone of comfort. And there is indeed a bit of contradiction in terminis there. Humanitarian diplomacy, but diplomacy is a state prerogative. You all certainly remember, because you are all skilled diplomats, that the origin of diplomacy is to be found in the ancient Greek diploma, that is to say, a tool for the relation between the then big powers, great powers, which were the Greek cities. And Humanitarian aid is by definition non-governmental, and we see clearly the distinction between non-governmental and governmental mechanism when handling the situation on the ground in Afghanistan nowadays, for instance. Preparing this panel looked a little bit tricky, I must say, until yesterday evening ministerial segment. And then there were a few picks which I think I would like to share with you when introducing the discussion this afternoon. The first one, okay, it's a very personal selection, was Minister Le Drian referring to l'Union européenne comme une puissance humanitaire. Interesting concept. What does that mean? Then there was a very short but telling presentation by Martin Griffiths telling us how and what means negotiating access, and connecting clearly the issue of access with the one of IHL. And then third and last speak, the vibrant call from Jan Egeland for the presence of member states. Be there, said him repeatedly in his intervention yesterday evening. So all that reminds us that providing life-saving assistance to affected populations does not take place in isolation, but more than often in the context of the stark realities of power, injustice, and discrimination. And that access should be secured in a way that is compatible with humanitarian principle and does not endanger either the protection of civilians or the security of humanitarian workers. There is therefore room for a conversation, and thanks for being there to share this conversation with us. Although Ukraine, unfortunately, provides us with a once-in-a-lifetime illustration of what humanitarian diplomacy can achieve or not, we shouldn't let the discussion be overshadowed by what's going on the ground there. Anyway, you will know that there will be an extra session following this one dedicated to exactly what is now happening in Ukraine and how humanitarian aid is implemented in these days, taking into account the dramatic situation of this country. But there are also many other crises, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Ethiopia, where humanitarian diplomacy is at stake. So we have a large ground to cover. So we'll start, and really we are very happy, Stefano, that you managed to make it with us today, with, I would say, the most senior official of the European Diplomatic Service. Stefano, I know that you might not like your service to be labeled as the European Diplomatic Service. Some member states might have some sensitivities about that, but allow me, that's the academic freedom. So, Stefano, before taking into account this position, you had a very long diplomatic career in EU and also in national positions. So also, from a very personal point of view, I think that your introductory presentation about what you mean, what you see as humanitarian diplomacy, and the contribution to the EEAS to the development of an EU humanitarian diplomacy will be of the essence. Stefano, the floor is yours, and again, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Jeremy, thank you very much, and apologies for not being with you in presence. Unfortunately, in this last few weeks, even 10 minutes matter, and that's why, to my regret, I had to choose to finish a conference call which just ended a couple of minutes ago in order to be with you on time. First of all, let me say that I'm not disturbed at all by the fact that you want to define the External Action Service as the diplomatic service of the European Union, because I think that that's what we are. We are the diplomatic service of the EU, and when I say of the EU, I'm not taking away any of the institutions. I think that we are the diplomatic service for all the institutions, for the Commission, for the Council, even for the European Parliament, for every institutions. And I hope that member states will be happy with this, because my feeling is that we need to work together, especially in these very difficult moments. And unfortunately, exactly in moments like this, the humanitarian needs really are at a sort of record high. That was even true even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, aggravated, by the way, during the recent years by the COVID-19 pandemic and the exacerbation of conflicts following the climate change. So there is a trend on increased humanitarian needs, as there is a trend of increased violation of international humanitarian law. And that's also in a very worrying evolution, the shrinking space for the humanitarian assistance that we have been witnessing in the last 2 decades. This is true for the humanitarian activity, but even more generally, because these 2 decades have been marked by the growing level of crimes against civilians and deliberate threatening of humanitarian workers. And we have seen it, a lot of this in the last few years, be it in Syria or in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Yemen. And in many cases, the lack of compliance with the international humanitarian law is systemic, as local authorities and parties exert an undue influence over the humanitarian actors and hampers the needs-based delivery of the humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, we are entering almost 1 month of the last unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many say that the war in Ukraine did not start 1 month ago, that it started 8 years ago, when on the 20th of February of 2014, Crimea was illegally annexed to Russia. But what we are seeing in this last few weeks has been terrible. And we have to already 10 million people that have fled their homes. Many still internal displaced persons, but more than 3 million who had to leave their countries and are refugees in neighboring countries in the European Union, without forgetting the thousands of civilians that have been killed or injured up until now. These numbers are constantly growing, and the perspectives of peace, unfortunately, are not particularly encouraging. And under these circumstances, we see a serious problem of access for the World Food Programme and for the other humanitarian organizations that are trying to enter into besieged cities like Mariupol. The Russian invasion is also the risk of generating a hurricane of hunger and a meltdown of global food system, as the United Nations Secretary General Guterres emphasized. The ones most affected by all this, unfortunately, as usual, are the most vulnerable and the poorest people from many food deficit countries. And I'm thinking in particular to North Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Sub-Saharan Africa. Jointly with our member states, with the multilateral organization and other key partners, we are trying to react to this at multiple levels, not only to assess the risks of what is happening, but also to try to face the consequences of this emergency food crisis. And tomorrow, the college will approve a communication on safeguarding food security and reinforcing the resilience of the food system, which will include a very strong global dimension. I think that is important in these cases not only to look inside the European Union, which is absolutely legitimate concern, but also to look outside and to have a clear sense that what is happening in Europe is affecting, can affect enormously also third countries, especially the most vulnerable ones. This gloomy picture shows that the humanitarian diplomacy and the global solidarities are needed more than ever. And we have seen, especially during these last weeks, how the humanitarian diplomacy, and I would say the reaction of the people, of our public opinions, of our population, has been a very powerful tool to fight the aggression and to generate a pressure for key political decisions. We cannot say, unfortunately, it's still happening in Russia. We are trying to work on that, to have also the public opinion in Russia being aware of what is happening and understand the catastrophe that the country is running into. There will be, and there has been, we have started yesterday with the Foreign Affairs Council. Today there is a General Affairs Council, and Thursday and Friday an European Council. So it will be a very intense week, plus the NATO meeting, President Biden here in town and meeting our leaders. I think that this crisis has generated a real sense of unity in many of our countries, and we will need to keep on working in order to strengthen and to broaden the basis of this coalition that is trying to isolate Russia in this moment. Promoting the diplomacy in the humanitarian sector and in all other sectors, supporting people in need, defending human rights and international humanitarian law are firmly embedded not only in the Treaty of the European Union, but are also very much at the core of the mandate of the External Action Service. We are engaged in promoting multilateralism and international humanitarian law. And we are consistently advocating in the multilateral context for a rapid, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access and assistance to ensure the safe passage for humanitarian convoys and for civilians that have to leave the conflicted areas. We are working on the approval of a resolution on the humanitarian dimension of this crisis, following the one that has already been approved by the General Assembly, the resolution approved by the General Assembly of the UN against on the aggression against Ukraine, which was adopted back at the beginning of March. And in this resolution, the new one that we hope that can be passed yesterday and for which we are working hard in order to gather a strong consensus, we want to call all parties to allow safe and unfettered passage in order to allow people in danger to be able to leave the country, but also to allow humanitarian assistance to come in. And we do hope that, again, we can gather a very strong consensus around this, resolution. Apart this, we are, and you know very well that we are working on a number of other elements, which are, I would say, part of the overall toolbox at our disposal, speaking about the restrictive measures, sanctions, embargoes, the referral to the International Criminal Court, development assistance to countries that are in a difficult situation. If I can zoom out from the crisis itself in Ukraine, generated by the Russian aggression, in general, we are really trying to build bridges and to promote integrated approach to strengthening the partnership with different actors. Let me mention just a few of the main axis on which we are working. I know that I'm already out of time. I will try to be brief. In February, we hosted the 6th EU-African Union Summit, which was very much focused on strengthening partnership in areas like peace and security, multilateralism, economic development, addressing global challenges. This was a very important opportunity to, for meeting of key leaders, and also the first time that leaders were speaking to leaders, African leaders to European leaders, explaining their own sense of this partnership, their problems with their own societies, how they were dealing with them. And I think that it was a very important element to get a better sense and understanding in this perspective. One other area that I would like to mention is Syria and the conference on the future of Syria and the region. We will have in May the 6th conference. Unfortunately, this tells a lot about the length of this difficult process. And there again, we will try to bring together actors that are supporting the Syrian population and trying to put together a humanitarian response plan. And last but not least, I want to mention Afghanistan, which has been very at the very core of our action in these last few months. It's very good news that finally schools will be reopened for girls and young women. We hope that we are following very closely this. It's not the end of the process. There is still a lot to do in terms of strengthening the countries, its capacity. I cannot say about the democratic processes because maybe it's going too far, but at least to have some a measure of the improvement of the situation. We will continue working to support the inclusivity of the government, and we will continue to support women's rights and women's empowerment in the country. Just to conclude, Jean-Louis, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, I want to stress the importance of the nexus between humanitarian development and peace, which is an area in which also the Foreign Affairs Council has devoted attention. We have focused on the humanitarian, we have focused on development, we have focused on peace, and we will try to wrap up now all this work. The instrument that we have at our disposal, the NDICI, the Global Europe Instrument, can help us a lot from that point of view. It's a very much more powerful and flexible instrument that we have at our disposal, and we want to make it sure that we can use it in a way that is supportive of the agenda that together we want to develop with the countries in difficulty. With this, let me thank you once again for this invitation, and let me also take out this from the screen, and let me say that in this difficult global context, it's more important than ever to step up our engagement, to build a stronger and multi-layered partnership with all our countries around us, and to use all the instruments that we have available in our toolbox in order to support effective population and to address in the best possible way the crisis around the world. Once again, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Stefano. Thanks for having spared a few minutes of your so busy schedule to refer to the series of meetings that are taking place in Brussels this very week. You also reminded us how centerfold humanitarian concerns are in this, huge, unified and remarkable diplomatic effort which has been deployed since the beginning of the violent phase of the crisis in Ukraine. But you also, very rightly at the end of your presentation, zoomed out, referring to other occurrences. What I take also from your presentation, if you allow me, is that you intend and you would like EEAS to build bridges bridges, which is essential in an area where too often parties are seen as thinking and acting and behaving in silos. We should bear that in mind, and we might come back on that afterwards during the discussion. And last but not least, you refer to the toolbox, the EU toolbox, external relation toolbox, where indeed humanitarian aid appears more and more as one of the key components, one of the key and maybe most useful tools in this toolbox. But again, we'll come back on that again. Stefano has left in the meanwhile, so no time for us to ask him questions, but certainly our panelists will want to reflect on that, or you might wish to come back with questions during the Q&A. Let me now turn to the next panelist, the first one in person, Robert Mardini. Robert, you are the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I don't know why I mentioned that, everybody knows you. But Robert, I mean, the question to you will be very simple. How does humanitarian diplomacy fit within ICRC's mandate, and what has been your experience in effectively deploying HD? And referring to my introduction, I would add a personal comment. I have sometimes the feeling that ICRC is embodying a new form of diplomacy, that is to say, a stateless diplomacy. Please, Robert.
Sorry, a what?
Stateless diplomacy.
I need to use this, right?
Yep.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. It's interesting, your initial remarks, you were saying that the word humanitarian diplomacy is lacking in many places. But it has been at the very core of ICRC practice since its inception. I don't know now if the word in itself existed back then, but it has been part and parcel of the work of ICRC, be it when it comes to the development, promotion of the law, or to garner support for humanitarian access. When the founders of ICRC pushed for the negotiation of the first Geneva Convention back in 1964, that was humanitarian diplomacy in action. When now we are trying to negotiate with parties to the conflict in Ukraine, in a place like Mariupol, where civilians are in harm's way, caught between a rock and a hard place, when my colleagues on the ground are negotiating with parties to the conflict, when our president is negotiating with the Ukrainian ministers, and soon with the Russian authorities, this is humanitarian diplomacy. And to me, it's really about garnering support for a key issue. And for us, the key issue is what is the best interest of civilians in armed conflict. I think international humanitarian law gives us a very solid foundation, and humanitarian diplomacy is how to translate what is enshrined in international humanitarian law and get and negotiate the best possible deals for civilians. This is for us humanitarian diplomacy, and it is something that we don't do alone. It's something that we need to also partner to leverage other forces around us in order to have a better result. I can give maybe a couple of examples during the Syrian conflict that we got to know together. We realized that the best way to have a greater impact and being able to assist civilian population in besieged area was to join forces with colleagues from the UN system. And here the deal was UN agencies should also stay within the impartial, neutral humanitarian realm in order to be able to move the needle for greater access. Another example is more recently in Afghanistan, where we have joined forces also with OCHA to move the needle on key sanctions that were the very obstacle to support people in Afghanistan, and trying to convince key states to loosen some of the sanctions, some of the OFAC licenses, for instance, and also garnering support of the members of the Security Council to come up with a UN Security Council resolution having a clear carve-out, humanitarian carve-out exemption that would allow principal humanitarian action to happen, not only, by the way, to the ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, but to the broader community. However, there are obstacles to this. To me, the mother of all obstacles is the politicization of the humanitarian action, of the humanitarian aid, is when humanitarianism and humanitarian action becomes part and parcel of the political efforts, the political narrative of parties to the conflict, and when it becomes a real constraint for the work, and where we need, I think, as humanitarians, to make sure that there is a clear separation between the political work activity that sometimes goes in the sense of parties to the conflict. For us, it should go to find the sustainable solution or resolution to the conflict, and the humanitarian work that needs to be really separated in order to remain effective. And I think what is key here is to draw a clear distinction between political security initiative and the principal humanitarian space. And I think for this to happen, it is absolutely critical to build relationships, to build trust with the parties to the conflict, with states, with non-state armed groups, with partners and supporters of parties to the conflicts, in order to have a convergence of what will generate the best outcome for the civilian population. And I think we see this happening, and we see this as a key ingredient for all humanitarian work, be it in the Middle East, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, in Myanmar. It's always the same dynamics. And I think this is what principled humanitarian action is about if you want to be, to remain effective. Humanitarian access and the provision of humanitarian activities require a dialogue at all times. And it's not a one-off endeavor. It is something that should be built over time. It's a long-term approach. It is something that has to start before, during, and after the crisis or a conflict. And it's something that should be nurtured at any time. And trust can be lost overnight. It takes years to build it. It can lost overnight, and this is why it is important to remain very consistent and coordinated in humanitarian diplomacy effort when it comes to one organization or other organization claiming to be principled on the ground. It's important to be able really to have a consistent, a coherent messaging, because let's face it, we are tested at all times by interlocutors, by parties to the conflict, and discipline is, to me, also a key word from my personal experience. Also, securing access requires close knowledge and sensitivity to the particular dynamics of the conflicts, and those dynamics are very often fluid. They change. There is no one-size-fits-all. There is no one message that will carry the day over time. Things change, so we need to understand at all times the dynamic of context, how alliances shift in the same conflict, and be cognizant to these dynamics. So turning the question to the European Union's role in this domain, the EU certainly has a range of diplomatic tools at hand that can be leveraged to support these efforts. It was referred to by the previous speaker, in your introduction, Jean-Louis, that are important to influence respect for international humanitarian law and safeguarding the humanitarian space in conflict-affected areas. The EU's commitment as a major global actor and champion on these issues is very welcome, notably through its public statements, political dialogue, and diplomatic démarches. But other initiatives and tools also play an important part to reinforce such diplomacies, such as the EU human rights and IHL due diligence policy, for instance, the adoption of IHL country fact sheets, and a coherent and coordinated approach under the inter-service group on IHL or the Team Europe approach, for instance. And at the same time, from a humanitarian perspective, we recognize that the EU's engagement spans varieties of sectors, encompassing economic, political, and security interests, and this could impact its perception of neutrality by parties to armed conflict and the people affected by them. Perception is key to acceptance and access at all times, and this is why it is so important for political and humanitarian objectives to be distinct. And this, I think, plays out today in the framework of the Ukraine conflict, where the political component of EU has a clear positioning, but the humanitarian component of EU should remain principled in terms of perception. It's a difficult balancing act, but over time, this is the only way that pays off in the best interest of the people we are all serving. And in highly politicized environments, the EU and its member states nevertheless have a crucial role to play through indirect, discreet, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy, enabling and supporting other stakeholders, lending its own strong credibility and political capital. And just one example that comes to mind is the support and weight given to the mediation efforts of the African Union and individual African states. So to conclude, the EU can and should take a leading role in creating an enabling environment for principled humanitarian action, politically, financially, legally, and ultimately achieving humanitarian access is a shared challenge for all of us. Cooperation and a shared commitment to find solutions is the only realistic way forward, alleviating the suffering we see in today's armed conflict, and working to prevent it happening in the future is in everyone's interest. I will leave it here. Jean-Louis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Really. A lot of food for thought. We might come back on some of the things that you said. You insisted on the importance of trust, that all that takes a long time, that it's not a one-off operation. You also stresses the importance of a conflict-sensitive approach when dealing with humanitarian diplomacy, which is something which you bear in mind. Thanks a lot for your encouragement to the EU. I'm sure that if Stefano was still with us, he would have said, yes, we can. But let's now move to, okay, Stefano said it also in his introduction. It's the EU institution, but also member states. So, Ambassador Elama Ots, you represent your country, Estonia, in the Political and Security Committee of the EU. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, I would say that it is a one and only body at ambassador level which gets regular briefing on the humanitarian situation of the issues that it is supposed to deal with. So to have you with us as having the experience of the so-called PSC or COPS in French, depending on the acronym, is really an asset and a privilege. I would add also that your country has now stepped down from the UN Security Council for after a 2 years mandate as elected, not 2 days. Life is short, but not that short. 2 years mandate as an elected member. I mean, and your minister was present yesterday evening during the ministerial segment and referred to the lessons drawn from this experience. So all that being said, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really honor to be here in that panel, especially because I see all the practitioners around me, while I'm the diplomatic practitioner. So very, and when Stefano Sandino finished by saying that the EU has to promote the diplomacy of humanitarian aspects, maybe we are dealing actually with the promotion of, or maybe I'm trying to look at the, from that angle, how to promote the humanitarian side in a diplomacy, because I think that there is room for improvement, clearly. I'll just try to then focus my intervention on 3 points, maybe the experience from the United Nations Security Council, where Estonia is, I mean, we are such a tiny country, but we had really the super experience having this powerful worldwide role for 2 years. Then maybe a little bit about the member state perspective, especially in the COPs. How much do we actually pay attention to humanitarian aspects, and how does it play with the rest of our actions when we actually work with peace and security issues? And of course, then the last one is what the EU can do, and maybe some suggestions. From the United Nations Security Council level, of course, the biggest and probably the most challenging experience we had was this profound disagreement among the Security Council members about the guiding principles, whether we work on the basis of UN guiding principles or general humanitarian principles. The difference to the public is that humanitarian principles are like the universal. The UN guiding principles actually require and a member state by host nation consent. And if you know, of course, where the dire needs are and how much the humanitarian organizations are dependent on the host nations, this causes a major, major problem for us. And of course, I mean, the Syria would be the perfect example for that. So every negotiation had this aspect, and I think this was one of the new and most powerful experience that we had, that there is no joint disagreement even at that level about the principles that we are dealing with. Secondly, what we saw was that the humanitarian files are increasingly politicized. Clearly, I mean, there are these logic that we have to be, I mean, the organizations have to be neutral, impartial, they have to have access, etc. But we see that all big players, everybody who influence the real conflicts and who maybe whose word are probably key to actually end those conflicts, or even that they use the humanitarian aspects for the political end game and for political means. And this is, of course, the real issue also in those circles where actually we should really see what can be done to really alleviate the actual suffering on human beings there. And of course, I mean, initially this forum was supposed to take place before Ukraine appeared. So then my third point would have been that it's about time that the Security Council takes a hard and broader look about the application of those principles, etc. But of course, now when we are facing the situation and one of the peak 5 is among the biggest aggressors, at least biggest aggressor on European soil, I can't say that, but obviously this poses a serious challenges and questions once the war is over. What do we do in this situation? Of course, to be honest, I don't think that EU has any other way to support the universal values, try to hold the aggressor accountable, etc. But I mean, obviously, there should be some real reflection. How can UN and the highest body responsible globally for peace and security, how can they actually function in these situations? Especially when all the actions are basically explained by a totally false narratives. So we have a problem across the board. Now the member states' perspective. Clearly, I mean, in the Peace, Political and Security Committee, we do have, I mean, all of your organizations come regularly there to provide overview of what's, I mean, the hotspots in the world, what needs to be done. So we are the privileged body. At the same time, I now have to be a little bit self-critical here. I think once we actually adopt policies towards certain countries, then, to be honest, there might be much more knowledge about the actual situation. Even now, of course, the Ukraine is the perfect example. We know that Ukrainians asked for the Red Cross to come and basically collect and document the Russian bodies. And it's not only the humanitarian issue, it's also the Stratcom issue to actually explain to the Russians what's really going on if the body bags keep coming back. To be honest, we are having discussions in our political committee every day, almost, in a non-secure and secure environment. But to be honest, we don't really pay attention then what successes you have so far. I understand there is this issue of neutrality and impartiality, that you are not coming to our body to give political advice. But I think maybe if as policymakers and diplomats in the EU, if we had better day-to-day knowledge about the real challenges but also success stories, I think it would maybe we would be able to make more informed decisions. So I think there should be a more better bridge built, as mentioned also by Stefano Sannino, between the practitioners and the policymakers, because I think we have there is clearly a lot to learn. And if you mention that, for example, in EU documents, there is hardly mentioning of the humanitarian diplomacy, it's because, yes, we all say it's important, but then we basically trust that the job is done by somebody else. And here, I mean, you mentioned the word trust. Trust is in capital letters in my brief, precisely because we clearly see the news, we see the numbers, we see the suffering, killing of the children, etc. So EU gives money, and then we trust that you are doing the job. And I'm sure that, I mean, EU has an extremely good relationship with all of the UN organizations. We are very happy, and we can trust it. But at the same time, I think that the feedback back to us, what else is needed, would be actually very useful and much appreciated. What else the member states can do? I think one of the success stories, and here, of course, the creation of EIS, the External Action Service, was very useful, is the outreach, the joint outreach through the EU delegations and member states jointly. One of the success stories was clearly the same latest Juncker resolution on Russia, 141 votes, unprecedented unity, showing clearly to those who want to see, maybe also in Moscow, where is the center of gravity in this situation. But here I think it could not have been done without the joint outreach. And here clearly I think the EU could do much more of this kind of joint outreaches, and especially and reach out also to those countries who are not the usual like-minded countries. Because we work very much on the basis of geographical groups in the United Nations, but there are these issue-based coalitions, and I think this latest Juncker resolution was precisely that, where we found the support among those countries who are not the usual allies, but then we realized that, of course, but the universal values are, I mean, they are universal, and they can find understanding from countries that are usually not our partners, allies, or even unexpected partnerships. So, and I think in the EU there is this growing awareness that we should do much more, and the EIS is actually a very powerful tool. Because while even for us, I mean, Estonia is a very small member state. I mean, we are hardly represented in some continents, but the EU and through EU delegations we can do much more, and especially and the information sharing, for example, now in this Ukraine context, it's absolutely impressive, because I mean there is also not only that the EU delegations are doing their marches, but really member states informing who spoke to whom, who needs to be convinced, so what else could be done, so it was really, really remarkable. Then additional, I'd like to bring forward the issue of Stratcom. We clearly see that everybody understands when there is a major suffering. If you show the pictures of, I don't know, dying kids, then we get more money. And of course that's very good, because we have to somehow get the support, public support. But I think the stories, the success stories, are less told. And I think maybe this is really something to be said and told much more also by the diplomats, that actually the work that you're doing is so valuable and so needed, but the story is not told anymore. So the story is told, told in the first phase of the conflict and the suffering, but not when there are real success stories, and maybe the selling could be done better together with member states and the organizations. Now about what you could do, I mentioned the common humanitarian messages, common demarches, common policies, the same that you all mentioned. Outreach to non-like-minded, in any case, but non-like-minded partners. But then very important job that the EU is doing is the fight against impunity. And this is something that we've pressed high importance. Now the ICC, we constantly hear about the financial problems, etc., about the UN relevant bodies. ICC clearly is something that the EU member states value more and more, because this, and that's of course, especially now these days when we have everybody can take mobile pictures about the suffering, but somebody who collects, systematizes the documentation, what is around, and of course bring perpetrators to justice. I think it's extremely important, and also to public to show that, I mean, even if you get by with your aggression today, you might not do it tomorrow. And I think politically and diplomacy-wise, it's very, very important to say. So EU has to continue living up to rule and promoting the rule-based world order and respect for the humanitarian law. And of course, I mean, our first, in the political committee, the first priority is to bring peace, because this is the main means to decrease the suffering. But of course, we all understand that this humanitarian development and peace nexus have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. First of all, being Belgian myself, let me stress once and for all that there are no such thing as big and small member states inside the EU, with all due respect for the French presidency, by the way. I'm extremely impressed by the candid way you express yourself. I mean, I rarely saw an ambassador distanciating herself so much from a diplomatic language. Thank you very much for... Thank you very much for having done it. You already added a lot of different dimensions. I mean, amongst other things, you refer to communication, information, and disinformation, which of course is at stake every day when dealing with a crisis like Ukraine, but in so many other circumstances also. But we'll come back on that after all. Now, I will give ECHO the unique opportunity to have a return on the huge investment they made by providing interpretation for all these sessions, parce que je vais introduire le prochain orateur en français, et il a choisi, en tout cas pour sa première intervention, de s'exprimer en français. J'ai le plaisir, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir parmi nous Monsieur Désir, Harlem Désir, qui est vice-président de, alors là quand même, l'International Rescue Committee. Je ne pense pas qu'il y ait une traduction en français. On va en rester avec l'acronyme anglo-saxon. Monsieur Désir, vous êtes une personnalité connue. Vous avez une longue carrière de plaidoyer en France, où vous avez même exercé à un moment donné des responsabilités et des mandats de type politique. Et puis surtout, alors là je vais être prudent parce que je sais qu'il y a des représentants d'autres ONG dans la salle, l'IRC est une des principales organisations non gouvernementales actives dans le domaine humanitaire globalement dans le monde aujourd'hui. Et je n'ai même pas parlé de la personnalité de son président. Monsieur le vice-président, Monsieur Désir, comment, en tant que représentant de la famille des ONG, voyez-vous les inconvénients, les avantages, les défauts, les risques, le besoin de la diplomatie humanitaire?
Merci, cher Jean-Louis, mesdames et messieurs, du plaisir de pouvoir participer à ce débat et de votre invitation. L'IRC a des opérations dans plus de 40 pays dans le monde. Et ce que nous voyons d'abord, comme chacun d'entre vous, c'est l'écart entre les besoins humanitaires grandissants et les ressources. En 2022, il y aura 274 millions de personnes qui auront besoin d'aide humanitaire. Il y en a 41 millions qui sont au bord de la famine. Il y a plus de 80 millions de personnes déplacées ou réfugiées. Et la guerre en Ukraine ne va faire qu'accroître ce nombre de personnes en besoin d'assistance humanitaire. Mais dans le même temps, ce que nous voyons, c'est que l'an dernier, les appels à financement pour les plans de réponse humanitaire des Nations Unies, des agences des Nations Unies, n'ont été souscrits par les États qu'à hauteur de 49%. Et c'était, je crois, 63% en 2019, avant la crise du Covid. C'est-à-dire qu'on a assisté à une chute vertigineuse de la solidarité internationale. Et on peut craindre aujourd'hui, en plus des besoins qui sont générés par la crise ukrainienne, qu'il y ait, vous le savez, une hausse des prix des céréales et une insécurité alimentaire, voire des famines plus importantes encore dans beaucoup d'autres régions du monde, où les crises ne se sont pas résolues par miracle parce qu'il y a la guerre en Ukraine, mais qu'en plus il y ait encore moins d'attention et moins de solidarité vis-à-vis de ces autres régions. Alors, on pourrait au moins espérer que dans un contexte pareil, l'accès aux populations en besoin soit garanti, mais nous savons que ce n'est pas le cas, loin de là, et qu'au contraire, on a assisté à une dégradation de cet accès et qu'il y a de plus en plus de pays qui se trouvent dans la situation où étaient autrefois des pays comme la Syrie et le Yémen. Et aujourd'hui, ce sont de très très nombreux pays dans lesquels l'accès aux populations est devenu difficile. Alors, qu'est-ce que nous voyons? On pourrait dire qu'il y a d'une certaine façon 3 types de restrictions à l'accès aux populations. Si je prends quelques exemples. Le premier, c'est le refus délibéré d'accès. Et l'instrumentalisation, comme l'a dit Robert Mardini, la politisation de l'accès humanitaire comme un élément de négociation, comme une mise en balance par les acteurs du conflit qui ouvrent, ferment, créent des corridors, bombardent les populations. On a vu cela à grande échelle dans plusieurs villes syriennes, On l'a vu à Homs, on l'a vu à Alep, on l'a vu dans la Ghouta orientale, lors de la bataille de la Ghouta orientale, et on le voit aujourd'hui, malheureusement, en Ukraine. On l'a vu avec les populations civiles qui voulaient sortir de Mariupol, et on le voit dans les autres villes assiégées d'Ukraine. Deuxièmement, nous voyons aussi parfois une utilisation de la bureaucratie comme un prétexte pour ralentir, en fait, ou de fait, avec comme résultat de rendre beaucoup plus difficile l'accès aux populations. C'est le cas de ce que nos équipes voient par exemple au Yémen, aussi bien dans le nord Yémen que dans le sud Yémen, où il faut 3 mois de démarches administratives pour pouvoir obtenir les différentes autorisations et parfois des semaines d'attente pour avoir les visas pour que les équipes humanitaires puissent aller délivrer les aides humanitaires et l'assistance aux populations. Et puis, je voudrais mentionner un troisième défi auquel nous sommes confrontés, qui est l'impact de certaines législations antiterroristes, qui sont évidemment en elles-mêmes justifiées, mais qui, quand les exceptions humanitaires ne sont pas bien définies, et il y a eu une référence tout à l'heure à l'Afghanistan, mais là je parle de l'accès aux populations, peuvent devenir des véritables obstacles à accéder aux populations ou à délivrer l'aide. Et je citerai par exemple le nord-est du Nigeria, où beaucoup d'ONG, mais aussi d'institutions financières, de banques, sont dans un extrêmement grand risque quand il s'agit d'acheminer des aides, des fonds à des populations, parce que s'il n'y a pas de clarté sur le cadre législatif et l'exception humanitaire aux législations antiterroristes, eh bien, vous avez le risque de voir vos personnels poursuivis, arrêtés et mis en danger. Et donc cela freine vraiment de façon très conséquente l'accès humanitaire. Alors, avant de venir aux recommandations, je voudrais faire une remarque. C'est que les acteurs humanitaires, ça a été mentionné pour le Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, mais beaucoup d'entre eux sont de fait, à côté des diplomates et des représentants des Nations Unies, déjà des acteurs de la mise en œuvre du droit humanitaire international et sont de fait des acteurs de la diplomatie humanitaire. Mais cela nécessiterait d'être peut-être mieux reconnu et d'être soutenu et nécessiterait, et j'en ferai une proposition, notamment qu'il y ait une coordination avec OCHA, par exemple, sur le terrain et des formations. Je voudrais dire aussi que lorsque l'Union européenne décide de retourner après le changement de régime au mois d'août en Afghanistan, à Kaboul, avec ECHO notamment d'abord, et de mettre la question de l'accès humanitaire en premier, de mettre parmi les benchmarks, je ne sais pas s'il faut traduire par conditions ici, parce que ce n'était pas exactement le terme, mais parmi les critères qui lui permettent d'être présent, le rôle des femmes, notamment dans l'action humanitaire. Et pour nous, c'est très important. Nous avons plus de 3000 personnels, principalement afghans, qui sont restés en Afghanistan dans 10 régions. Nous ne sommes jamais partis. La chef de nos opérations est une femme américaine, la numéro 2 est une femme afghane, elles doivent pouvoir circuler comme tous les personnels, et près de la moitié de nos personnels sont des femmes. Lorsque l'Union européenne est là, elle est présente, c'est extrêmement important. Et c'est important aussi la façon dont l'Union européenne s'est engagée avec les acteurs en Libye ou avec parfois d'autres autorités étatiques pour lesquelles il n'y a pas de problème de reconnaissance diplomatique, mais qui voulaient imposer des conditions aux acteurs humanitaires, par exemple les escortes armées au Niger, qui posaient énormément en fait de problèmes de sécurité. Donc je veux dire que déjà, et c'est très très bien, ECHO et l'Union européenne et le SEAE sont extrêmement présents sur ce terrain. Mais maintenant, il faut quand même essayer d'aller plus loin. Alors, peut-être 3 recommandations à mentionner comme ça. La première, c'est qu'il faut documenter les violations du droit international humanitaire. Nous sommes dans un âge de l'impunité, comme dit David Miliband, qui est le président de l'IRC, et nous voyons cette impunité se répandre, d'autant plus que le Conseil de sécurité est bloqué par l'abus du droit de veto. Il y a des juridictions nationales universelles ou internationales, il faut les utiliser, mais pour ça, il faut commencer par documenter les violations. Vous l'avez dit, Madame l'ambassadrice, et c'est extrêmement important, notamment aujourd'hui en Ukraine, mais aussi dans beaucoup d'autres conflits. Deuxièmement, je le disais, il faut soutenir et renforcer les capacités locales des acteurs non étatiques, en particulier des ONG, internationales ou locales, qui de fait participent tous les jours à des discussions pour faire respecter le droit d'accès et faire respecter le droit humanitaire international. Et je le disais, en particulier les Nations Unies et OCHA pourraient jouer un rôle de coordination et de soutien très important. Troisièmement, l'Union européenne, je crois que le commissaire Lenarčič l'a dit hier soir, ainsi que tout à l'heure le secrétaire général Stefano Sannino, doit vraiment faire de cette question du respect du droit humanitaire international un axe très important de sa diplomatie et de ses relations avec ses partenaires. Et je pense en particulier que quand il y a des accords de partenariat stratégique avec des pays avec lesquels il y a toutes sortes d'accords commerciaux, d'accords de sécurité, d'accords économiques qui sont passés, mais en particulier quand il y a une dimension de sécurité à ces accords, la formation au respect du droit international humanitaire par les partenaires stratégiques, par les forces armées, par les représentants des institutions, doit être absolument centrale dans la diplomatie internationale de l'Union européenne. Et je crois que cela sera une contribution très importante à la diplomatie humanitaire et au respect du droit humanitaire international et à l'accès aux populations en besoin. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Encore une fois, les interventions des panélistes s'enchaînent et apportent chaque fois de nouvelles dimensions à notre échange de vues cet après-midi. Vous avez rapporté une expérience de terrain tout à fait importante, notamment en distinguant les différentes formes d'obstacles à l'accès et les difficultés auxquelles, d'autres types de difficultés auxquelles peuvent se heurter dans leurs relations avec les parties en présence au conflit, les organisations humanitaires sur le terrain, dans des situations de conflit, de guerre ou de tension. This leads me, of course, in a very natural way to the last and fourth and last panelist of this first part of this afternoon conversation, Roland Kobias. When preparing this panel, we were of the view that we absolutely needed the presence of an EU head of delegation. Because on the ground, I mean, all these, very broadly formulated and very positive approach of the role that the EU can play in terms of humanitarian diplomacy, on the ground, I mean, the person holding the position of EU head of delegation, EU head of local delegation, plays an absolutely key role. Not only as representative of the EU, but it was mentioned to you, Madam Ambassador, as ensuring a coordination function between member states in passing integrated humanitarian message, and also by making use of the different tools which are available, amongst other things, cooperation tools. Roland, it happens that you have been in different positions, not so comfortable position, I have to say, but which were all relevant for the purpose of the discussion this afternoon. Let me mention Myanmar, Afghanistan, and nowadays Ethiopia. And mind you, Roland, your boss is not with us anymore, so you are absolutely free to speak as you wish. Roland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, and you're putting me in my comfort zone, indeed, as you mentioned at the beginning. So thank you very much. Look, you gave me the homework of talking about the field and the ground and share, observations and sort of constatations about what we have seen. And I must say that anything I say is actually reflecting what I saw and what I felt on the ground, and sometimes departs from theory and from what is sometimes felt about the more theoretical expectations than one can have in capitals. So I have I organized this little talk around two baskets. The first one is really about, and that's in a way the first message I wanted to convey, is that perfection does not exist in conflict countries or in highly polarized political environments. And I will try to illustrate that with examples. The first one is that we all agree here, and I think there's a total consensus, that humanitarian aid needs to be neutral, impartial, independent, and so on and so forth. And this is the right thing. The problem is perception on the ground. This is not the way that humanitarian aid is perceived by a lot of actors on the ground, be it governments or regional authorities, or sometimes even civil society, and so on and so forth. On the contrary, what I have seen over 20 years, both in Africa and in Asia, is that people perceive any type of foreign, between inverted brackets, intervention as being politicized and as being politically motivated. And there's not much difference in a way between development aid, which we see is turning into a more conditional era, and humanitarian aid, because the nuances on the ground is not there. So that is the first problem. I take as an example when I was in Myanmar, you know, all the work we have done, rightly so, for the Rohingya in Rakhine was perceived by the other community, the Buddhists, as being extremely, extremely politically motivated. For them, there was too much focus on one community, the Rohingya, and there was not enough focus on the Buddhist community, which they were saying was also in dire need and suffering and so on and so forth. Same in Ethiopia, where I am now. You know, there's been a very high focus on Tigray, rightly so, because the needs are dire. But there are also other areas, other regions, which have tremendous humanitarian needs. And at a certain stage, you need to make an arbitrage, because one of the speakers, I think it was you, Robert, or Mr. Desir, was saying that there are too many needs for the resources we have. And so when you have a lot of needs, increasing needs today, with less resources, well, you need to make a political arbitrage. That's the first point. On the second point, which follows to that, I think there's a great gap between the de jure principles that we find in all our textbooks and the de facto implementation constraints. The reality out there on the ground is that very often these principles are not understood the same way they are understood in capitals. And this is because of many factors. I can mention, you know, different ideologies, different cultural environments, different, you know, way of looking at the world today. The anti-Western sentiment is very much there because these values are not perceived as universal. We believe they are universal. Out there, they don't believe they are universal. They believe that these are Western values that have been imposed upon them through the UN Charter. It is terrible to say, but this is what I heard that again, you know, a few days ago. So I think the local sensitivities are really something that are qualifying the humanitarian aid intervention. And we had a very clear example recently on the UN General Assembly on Ukraine. It was not a question of the West versus the East. It was about universal principles. And many countries have have abstained, and 5 countries have voted against this charter. So it is quite strong. The third point in this basket is that I think to enhance the chances of humanitarian access, we need to recognize that not humanitarian, but human action is imperfect by nature. And in this sense, we need to accept, if we want to be efficient, if we want the aid to reach the people, if we want to achieve what is to me, I'm not humanitarian, but what is to me the way I see humanitarians' ultimate objectives, which is to reach the population in need, we need to accept a certain degree of imperfection. The principles, I think, are not incompatible with a certain degree of pragmatism, and I would even say inventivity. How to implement these principles to match the ground. I think it's possible. My fourth point is the balance in approach. I have seen many cases in which the fact that we were very much focused on one region or one community or one category of recipient actually created more problems because the host authorities were saying, why are you focusing so much on one community? There are needs elsewhere. And this sort of sometimes lack of balance was actually creating hurdles in order to reach the objective, to reach the community we were actually trying to reach. Very clearly again in Myanmar with the Rohingya, very clear in Ethiopia. A counterexample was Afghanistan, because the Taliban are not particularly known for their willingness to be balanced. And there, you know, if we wanted to reach the minority, the Shia minority there, the Hazaras, well, the more we wanted to help them, the more it created problems with the Taliban, who are Sunni and who did not want, you know, any aid to go to other communities. So that was a counterexample. My last point under this basket is, and it follows from the previous point, is that I think the monofocus on certain regions or people can actually have the reverse effect. It can polarize. and it can limit access to these people because the authorities sort of become protective, defensive, and even stop the possibility of getting humanitarian aid to these people. And what we have seen with the Rohingyas in Myanmar is that the polarization was so high because they thought that we were politically motivated that it led to, chasing away these people from the very country. So it went to the ultimate, effect of these people not only not having aid, but being chased away. My second basket is shorter. It's on the fact, and a few speakers have referred to that in different ways. What I have seen is that the humanitarian and diplomatic work are two sides of the same coin of our European currency. They are different, they are two sides, but they're still on the same coin. And I would even say I would go further than Europe of what should be the world currency. Now, number one, I don't think that any area of work, any of our fields of action can stand alone. Nobody can act in a vacuum. Everything is linked and more so. They are bridges. They are invisible bridges sometimes, but they are also very visible bridges. So I think, and I come again to the perception, because this is the way it is perceived. Nobody believes nobody, that's a big word. Very few people believe in difficult countries, in conflict, that humanitarian aid can act alone, and that it's de-linked to everything else. They just don't believe in this. We believe in this, but they don't. They see strings attached. They see, work behind the scenes. Why are we sending people there? Maybe to get information, maybe to pass messages, and so on. And we need to take this into account, even if it is not true. Secondly, and working a little bit in the academic sector as well, I hear a lot of academics who always make a dilemma of protecting values and protecting interests. I don't think there is a dilemma there. I think protecting our values is protecting our interests. It's the same thing. The more we will protect our values, the more we will promote and defend our values, the more we will promote our European and I hope global interests. And I think the puissance humanitaire that you referred to of Le Drian is exactly this, is protecting our interest to our values. Thirdly, the diplomatic and humanitarian, I think, also walk hand in hand. Giving the hand to somebody when you're in the street still makes you two different individuals. However, there is a connection. And I think there is a connection. What the humanitarian do and say on the ground has an impact on the politics. What the politics do and say in the ground has an impact on the humanitarian. There's no silo out there. Everything is linked together. And what we try to do, and I can assure you that this is very strongly the case everywhere I went, is a real willingness of the political to have as a talking point in all our meetings with the authorities the humanitarian aspect. There's not a single meeting I have in Ethiopia today where I don't mention humanitarian access. It is part of our talking points, not because we have to, but because it is a central issue. So I think the link, the structural link is there. My last point, somebody referred to the no one size fits all. I think it was you. Fully agree with that. I think even the principles need to be, in a way, adapted to the ground. A political and security environment that is very difficult, like Afghanistan, you need to take this into consideration. You need to talk to the Taliban. You like them or not, you need to talk to them. You need to ensure that you negotiate, that you engage, that you convince them that they need to accept humanitarian aid. The time factor is also interesting. What the EU does at a certain point of time. For instance, in Afghanistan, we were very strongly involved in the preparation of presidential elections. At the same time, very much involved in the peace process. That creates a political framework. That creates antagonism sometimes. And I think the humanitarian action at that very moment was more complicated because of that than it would be in normal times. Voilà, I will stop here and very happy to engage in the discussion. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Roland. And again, thank you very much. I was expecting this kind of thought-provoking contribution from your side, but we're going to have to reflect to the two sides of the same coin or hand-in-hand approach that you elaborated upon, and hear the audience about what they see, about how they think about it, and how they see it actually happening. By the way, this is an invitation to all of you, including those liaison with us in a virtual way, to start sharpening your knives and preparing your question for the last part, which is going to be the Q&A session, following the intervention of Minister Radulovic, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro. We are very honored, Mr. Minister, to have you with us this afternoon. The floor is yours. We're really glad to hear the view of candidate member states about how they see the EU, the humanitarian diplomacy, and the future role of the EU in relation with humanitarian diplomacy. Please, lecture is yours too.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah, it works. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for the floor. Okay. Frankly speaking, I came here with a prepared speech more or less, but I don't believe that I will toe the line in this case, because after these very much inspiring interventions, you cannot be so much punctual, and to talk about these things like that. So, Jean-Louis, frankly, you made me pensive when you mentioned definitions, and humanitarian diplomacy. I think it's not about definitions at all. It's about deeds, it's about values, and it's about the thing that stems very much from the very core of the name humanitarian. Human. Are we human? Are we humans? Can we afford ourselves to turn the blind eye on the things rapidly unfolding in front of our eyes on European soil right now? And what's going on European soil right now? Just to briefly, echo on that. Since the World War II, for the first time, we witnessed that one country, under the feeble pretext, if pretext at all, attacked another sovereign country member of the United Nations. So I think that 24th of February was a huge game changer in our European history, regardless of the fact whether we are candidate countries or we are members of the EU, but that was a turning point in our history. And speaking on behalf of my country, of Montenegro, as you said, we are a candidate country, and we've been negotiating for the last 9 years, and we could be very much proud of ourselves that so far we have achieved to be part of NATO, and likewise, the country that has 100% alignment with common foreign security policy. In practice, in simple English, it means that we impose sanctions on Russia for their deeds, or misdeeds, better said. I think that we've been witnessing over the last month, let's say, different battle of narratives. So some media outlets and political stakeholders, they try, simply said, to vindicate what's going on in Ukraine. But my country, from the very much outset, took a very clear position and called the things with the right name: aggression. So what we see right now is aggression and invasion of one sovereign country, and we cannot find any kind of, we shouldn't try to belittle or to mitigate what's going on there by finding some euphemisms or metaphorical names in order to call it a special operation. So that's why I'm glad that International Court of Justice, requested that from Russia Federation to immediately cease hostilities there, and to avail civilians to leave the country, and to spare those who are not legitimate military targets, whatever that means. So, as I said, 24th of February was a turning point in our US history. So we should ask ourselves, are we going back to the 30s of the last century? Should we arm ourselves? Should we exchange a dialogue for weapons? I mean, where are we heading to? That's the main question that we should respond to ourselves, because it's the sake not just for our generation, but likewise for the posterity. So, without any kind of ambiguities, Montenegro supports territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And of course, being the smallest country, we are very much sensitive, the smallest country in the region and among the smallest country on European soil. We are very much sensitive to any kind of shockwaves that might undermine stability and security architecture of the continent. And that's why we always put diplomacy to the fore and dialogue to the fore. And I hope that these direct communications between Russian and Ukrainian side would provide something palpable, for the sake of the vulnerable people there and for the people in need. And by the way, just for the sake of the clarity here, does anybody talk here about COVID-19? It has been forgotten, because new threat is looming on the horizon. Actually, it's not on the horizon, it's on the ground. And we have two pestilences, let's call it like that, COVID-19 and war, confluence, making one huge confluence, making one torrent of troubles. So, as I said, we should be very much, as humans, concerned, and we should ask ourselves whether maternity wards, hospitals, schools should be, by any means, by any pretexts, legitimate military targets. I would say no. And definitely we cannot turn the blind eye on that. And just what we need, because definitely we cannot start the war right now, although it would be our wishful thinking. Definitely, Russia has to adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law and to allow civilians to flee the country in order, to mitigate all these casualties and atrocities being committed on European soil. And definitely, not just European countries, but whole world has. We must have unique approach and unequivocal approach when it comes to that. So, speaking of the EU, you know that the EU is the most important foreign policy goal. And the EU, of course, that's very much has alluring power to attract other nations. So far, it's the only multilateral organization, to my best knowledge, that adopted guidelines on promoting compliance with international humanitarian law. And I really, truly, as a European, applaud to that, because we shouldn't be idle. We shouldn't be sitting with our arm crossed, and we should be more reactive in order to seize hostilities there in Ukraine. But just the EU is the one part. Also member states. We, as a member states, they do have to finish their part of the work. Because we need the synergy of all political stakeholders at multilateral and bilateral level in order to try to alleviate suffering in Ukraine. So, speaking of bilateral approach, just to provide a glimpse of what my country has done so far. Of course, we are, as I said, among the smallest country in Europe, but in this case, as Jean-Louis said, I think so, he said that size doesn't matter, really. That's very much important. So far, we have provided humanitarian aid and financial aid, and that was not the first time when my country jumped in, to help and to provide safe haven to other refugees. Just for the sake of the facts, back in 1999, we had war in Western Balkans, and more than 200,000 people fled neighboring countries in order to seek and to find a shelter from war machineries. And my country received them all. We received 200,000 refugees fleeing from war machineries. And just again, for the sake of the facts, we are 0.6 million people country. So which means in figures, we received 1/3 of our overall population. And allow me not to be modest right now, right here, and to say that I don't know any country, in Europe at least, that would receive 1/3 of its own population, refugees fleeing from war machinery. Of course, let's talk about Ukraine and refugees fleeing from Ukraine. Montenegro, again, we so far received 7,000 people. And of course, that number is going to be bigger and bigger as the time goes by. Unfortunately, I'm repeating here, unfortunately. And personally, last week I visited refugees and just, I met children there, and I cannot describe with words a profound sorrow that I saw in their eyes because they had to flee their own country. And moreover, the stories that I heard from them, frankly, it tore apart my heart. And just, we have to stay, shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and we have to show solidarity and just to have unequivocal approach when it comes to that. And I mean, I tried to inspire my colleagues, my crew at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they did the same. We started gathering some financial aid, for them, and the same is going to be delivered to the refugee camps in the northern part of the country. So that is what humanitarian diplomacy really means. Step by step, bit by bit, one euro after another, one lunch after another, we should provide those people safe haven, and we should try to alleviate their sufferings. I mean, the one thing that Europe could brag about is peace. And I think that I sometimes think that, the EU has forgotten what war really means, because it happened a long time ago. I belong to generation, I was born in 1984, so still I have very much vivid memories, from the Balkan Wars, when I saw torrents and flows of refugees trying to flee the country. And if we are going to be humans, those people should be welcomed with our arms wide open. And as always, and this is true more than ever right now, united we stand, divided we fall. And we shouldn't allow to fall this time, because if we fall, the whole values and principles and the whole structure that we built over the last 80 years would crumble. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for this extremely powerful message. You reminded us that humanitarian diplomacy is first and foremost a human-centric diplomacy. And I was quite impressed by the figures that you quoted. Usually these last years one used to refer to Lebanon as hosting a number of Syrian refugees which was equal to 1/4 of this population, but in the case of the Montenegro it was 1/3 of the population at the time of the war in ex-Yugoslavia. Now we have to show a bit of flexibility, because initially we were waiting, we were expecting Madame Samate, Commissioner for Political Affairs of the African Union, to connect with us via virtually, but I understand that it will not be technically possible this afternoon. This being said, the voice of Africa and the political voice of Africa will still be heard. It happens that we have among the distinguished audience Mr. Agbenonsi. Vous êtes ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République du Bénin, Monsieur le Ministre, et nous vous cédons la parole bien volontiers si vous voulez nous rejoindre sur l'estrade. Monsieur le Ministre, soyez le bienvenu.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I think we met during my humanitarian coordinator times in Mali a few years ago.
It's a small world.
Yes. And I just want to thank Jean-Yves Le Drian and the Commissioner for inviting me to join this gathering. I need to switch now to French because my country is a French-speaking country, and if I continue speaking English, they would say that I create a constitutional problem. Je voudrais dire que j'ai écouté les présentations et je suis heureux de retrouver quelques amis avec qui j'ai partagé cette vie humanitaire. Je vois Panos qui est ici et j'ai écouté vos interventions et j'ai essayé de me retrouver un peu dans mes anciens souliers et peut-être dans mes anciennes vestes ou mes anciennes tenues de HC. Et je me suis demandé, est-ce qu'on est dans un dialogue qui est très réel? Et je me suis dit, en partant de la salle discrètement comme j'aime, sans rien dire, j'aurais manqué un devoir de solidarité vis-à-vis de mon ancienne famille humanitaire, un devoir de vérité vis-à-vis de ce qu'est la vie. Parce que nous avons tendance à nous enfermer dans notre bulle d'humanitaire. Nous avons tendance à nous enfermer dans nos principes de éco ou dans nos principes de OCHA. I was OCHA. Et je voudrais vous dire que la vie ne se passe pas comme ça. La preuve, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui avec l'Ukraine est une chose qui nous choque. Et je crois que ce qu'il faut faire en faveur de la réalité humanitaire, c'est de convaincre les acteurs de l'espace humanitaire qu'il n'y a pas de cloison hermétique. Il n'y a pas de barrière entre la réalité pour pouvoir apporter l'assistance à la vie de ceux qui sont en danger. Parce que lorsque je me lève pour aller négocier l'accès à MSF ou à d'autres, à Gao ou à Tombouctou, c'est bien de diplomatie qu'il s'agit. Il faut parler avec des acteurs qui ne sont pas prêts à parler avec vous, qui ne vous acceptent pas. Qui ne vous acceptent pas parce que vous représentez quelque chose qui est une négation pour eux. Alors, en plus forte raison, vous êtes un HC, vous êtes noir, vous êtes un vendu peut-être. Mais il faut parler avec eux pour leur dire qu'il y a des vies qu'il faut sauver. C'est pour ça que j'ai beaucoup aimé ce qu'a dit tout à l'heure l'ancien chef de délégation de l'Union européenne pour ce qu'il a fait au Myanmar ou ce qu'il a pu faire en Éthiopie. Ça, c'est un exemple. L'autre exemple, c'est, en dehors de cet accès-là, il faut pouvoir parler aux acteurs et il faut pouvoir utiliser la neutralité de certains acteurs. And I'm thinking of ICRC. J'ai de très bonnes relations avec certains de vos acteurs. C'est le cas au Mali. Je suis arrivé au Mali 10 jours avant le coup d'État de Sanogo. Et quand la nuit, il téléphone pour dire je vais faire sauter toute la ville, mais il faut aller le voir. Il ne faut pas attendre qu'il fasse le fou parce qu'il avait les moyens de faire sauter certaines parties de la ville. Donc il faut pouvoir se déplacer, parler avec lui, lui expliquer que vous n'êtes pas là parce que vous représentez un pouvoir, vous représentez une puissance, vous représentez des valeurs en dehors de celles auxquelles il croit, la justice, puisqu'il vous l'a dit. Vous représentez des valeurs comme le droit de vivre des autres, comme il vous l'a dit, et vous parlez avec lui. Donc ce que je veux dire ici, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de diplomatie humanitaire en dehors de la diplomatie. La diplomatie, elle est globale. Et quand il y a 6 ans, alors que j'étais humanitarian coordinator, guess where? En Centrafrique. Donc vous voyez, des terrains où je suis passé, des théâtres où je suis passé sont encore actifs. Et qu'on vous dit en pleine nuit, il y a 10 000 personnes qui sont à Berbérati, qu'on a chassées de leur village, parce qu'on a tué peut-être 10, 20, 30 personnes, et qui sont dans la cour de la mission. Et que l'évêque vous appelle pour dire « Qu'est-ce que je fais? Vous êtes le HC. » C'est par diplomatie que vous arrivez à négocier avec les violents. C'est par diplomatie que vous arrivez à négocier les moyens par lesquels, soit Sangaris ou bien la MINUSCA dont je faisais partie, peut déployer un minimum de sécurité pour vous permettre d'apporter l'assistance aux personnes qui souffrent. Donc, lorsqu'on parle de diplomatie humanitaire, il faut bien mettre dans la tête des acteurs humanitaires, de ceux qui aujourd'hui sont au front, sont confrontés à la réalité, parce que quand la réalité commence, ce n'est pas Bruxelles, ce n'est pas New York qui sont au courant, c'est ceux qui sont là directement qui doivent apporter des réponses. C'est de leur dire que n'ayez pas peur de donner l'impression de vous salir les mains. Il faut parler avec ceux avec qui vous n'aurez pas aimé dîner ou souper ou faire des parties. Il faut pouvoir leur parler pour pouvoir obtenir d'eux la possibilité non seulement de l'accès, mais la possibilité de l'action. Cette action qui sauve, qui permet aux gens de survivre. Parce que ceux qui sont désespérés dans les camps, ceux qui sont désespérés dans des sites de recouvrement transitoire, provisoire, ce qu'ils veulent, c'est vivre, c'est être soigné, c'est boire de l'eau, c'est pouvoir faire accoucher une femme qui autrement, sans vous, sans votre action, peut mourir. Alors je voulais vous dire cela pour vous dire que la diplomatie, elle est une, elle est globale. Et depuis 6 ans que je suis ministre des Affaires étrangères de mon pays, donc je suis passé de l'autre côté. Ce n'est pas de la trahison, c'est le choix d'aller servir aussi mon pays. Vous vous rendez compte que l'action, elle est globale et elle est importante. Mais parce que cette action est importante et elle est globale, vous prenez du recul par moment. Je ne sais pas pourquoi Jean-Yves m'a invité, d'ailleurs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, parce que nous sommes vus à Paris il y a une quinzaine de jours et je reçois cette invitation et finalement je dis, ben, pourquoi pas, je veux venir. Nous sommes vus hier soir, j'étais à la ministérielle. La chose que je voudrais dire, c'est que nous devons aussi avoir un certain recul pour comprendre pourquoi ces crises. Et parce que ce recul est nécessaire pour comprendre pourquoi ces crises, les humanitaires doivent sortir de leur bulle et partager les leçons qu'ils apprennent avec les politiques. Ils doivent sortir de leur bulle, pas pour participer au choix, parce qu'on a fait un choix pour être humanitaire, mais pour influencer les choix. Certains me disent, mais pourquoi le Bénin a voté pour condamner la Russie à New York? Pourquoi 2 jours avant, le Bénin a voté sur la préalable qui consistait, doit-on mettre la question de l'Ukraine sur la table du Conseil des droits de l'homme dont nous sommes membres maintenant? J'ai dit oui. J'ai donné l'instruction à mon ambassadeur pour dire oui, vous votez oui, la question doit être discutée. À New York, nous avons voté aussi oui. Parce que il faut être cohérent. On ne peut pas condamner les violations des droits de la personne humaine. On ne peut pas condamner la violence injuste et dire, ah non, on va être neutre. Certains pays ont voté neutre. Certains pays ont même été absents de la salle. Ce n'est pas de la dignité. Je ne les juge pas, je n'ai cité aucun pays, mais quand on regarde les votes, on voit un peu ce qui s'est passé. Mais les acteurs humanitaires doivent pouvoir sortir un peu de la bulle, se connecter au monde politique pour dire, si vous faites le choix A, voilà ce que ça va coûter pour nous après. Si vous faites le choix B, voilà ce que ça va coûter. Et au moins là, on a là la conscience d'avoir dit ce qu'on doit dire, au lieu d'être enfermé dans une bulle en disant nous avons nos principes humanitaires, on ne les voit pas, on doit parler à la politique. Non, tout se retrouve. Et les choix que les politiques font, et aujourd'hui je suis un politique, les choix que les politiques font influencent le travail humanitaire. J'ai voulu partager avec vous cette expérience-là de quelqu'un qui a été de l'autre côté et qui est maintenant de ce côté et qui comprend que le tout tient dans un ensemble. Et cet ensemble doit être cohérent si nous voulons sauver les vies humaines. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Monsieur le ministre, j'ai envie de dire, heureusement que vous avez accepté l'invitation de Monsieur Le Drian. On aurait manqué votre intervention cet après-midi. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Okay. There is the usual race against time. We are late, but I will take as a prerogative of the moderator to select 4 questions that I will put respectively to our 4 panelists. And some of them are inspired by what we see on our screen. Maybe starting with you, Roland. There is this double question about what comes first, diplomacy or support to humanitarian aid or vice versa. I come back to what you say about the 2 sides of the same coins or the 2 persons walking hand in hand in the streets, and I really would like to have your views. I assume that you appreciated really what the Beninian minister said about how it happens in the ground. Tell us about your experience about how this should happen on the ground. Let me first list the 4 questions so that the fellow panelists could prepare themselves. Robert, I would direct to you the first question. what principle would you be ready to sacrifice to ensure access to people in need? And I would relate this to what Martin Griffiths said yesterday. He said he was referring to diplomacy to ensure or to secure access. And I remember vividly that at a certain point in time, he said, when you negotiate access, naming and shaming is probably not the best thing to do. So my question to you would be to say, is advocacy defending international humanitarian law and, I mean, making sure that those who are violating international humanitarian law are actually prosecuted, is it always compatible with diplomacy aiming at securing access? Madam Ambassador, I would like to ask you a question about the silos, and I would have to put the same question to Stefano if he would have been there. I know from insiders that our ambassadors at the EU level have had nightmarish days these last week, rewriting time and again the strategic compact, which will be adopted, blessed by the heads of state and government at the end of this week. For those of you who don't know what it is all about, it's a strategic compass for a stronger EU security and defense in the next decade, which is seen really as an absolutely central document, Mr. Minister will agree, I mean, setting the agenda for the security and defense in the EU. Should such a document be kept at arm's length by the humanitarian, or does it say something that the humanitarian should factor in when implementing their duties, doing what they are supposed to do? That's about the silos approach. And I will now keep the last question for Mr. Désir. It's about the politicization issue. Robert Mardini dwelled about it in depth during his presentation and said that it would be a difficult balancing act. That's what you said at a certain point in time. And I refer to, again, the intervention of another distinguished representative of the NGO community yesterday, Ayaan Egeland, during the ministerial segment. Isn't it there again, I will use the same expression as in the beginning, a contradiction in terminis? That is to say, on one end, advocating for more presence and intervention of states, and at the same time advocating for, preventing humanitarian aid to be politicized. Are states not political bodies, not political entities? So these would be the 4 questions. Roland, over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. So on the link between diplomacy and the support to humanitarian aid, I think in conflict situations, it is, as I said, a huge part of our work to try to, give the help we can give as diplomats to the increased humanitarian access. This is something that takes a lot of our energy, a lot of our time, and I think this is the right thing to do. What we can do in doing this is talking to everyone. I know there are sometimes reticence of certain actors to talk to the bad guys, between inverted brackets. We can do that because we are diplomats, so we are there to do that. I think you need, in order to open humanitarian access and in order to support each other, you need to talk to everyone. You need sometimes to compromise. But what is very important is to keep the engagement and the dialogue open. The worst thing, and I have seen that in a number of countries, is when the channels of communication are broken. And this has happened on the ground, and this is the worst thing. And this is where I think diplomacy can really help the humanitarian field, is in doing everything it can to keep the channels open. The second thing I want to say in this is that being right today, in today's world, being right is not enough. We can't say, okay, we are right, so it must be like this, and we don't want to talk. On the ground, it doesn't work like this. Even though you are right, even though you are doing the right things, you need to convince that you are doing the right things. You need to communicate. Gone are the times, I think, where being right was enough. This is not today's world. So I think this is where diplomacy can help. And the final point, I do not entirely agree with the question when it says not vice versa. I think that if diplomacy helps the humanitarian, it means that there's a link. and that sometimes the humanitarian can help diplomacy. And I think the humanitarian, colleagues who are doing an incredible job, I would not be able to do that, honestly. What they do on the ground, I would not be able to do. They can also help diplomacy. Diplomacy in the noble sense of the term. We're not talking about politicien here. We're talking about the noble terms of diplomacy. And I think both sides can help each other.
That was exactly the message delivered by the Beninian minister. I mean, he said that that's the role of the humanitarians, to inform those taking political decisions about the consequences of their choice, and then let the decision be taken where it should be taken. Robert, about access.
Thank you, merci. Thank you. So what principle would you be ready to sacrifice to ensure access to people in need? The short answer, Jean-Louis, is none. We cannot compromise on principles. We cannot compromise on international humanitarian law. We say it repeatedly, IHL is not optional, it's non-negotiable. Having said that, the pragmatism is also when peoples are in harm's way, you need to pick your battle. So for instance, to ensure access in a place where people are under pressure, we will not to choose to have a dialogue on violations of IHL. Having said that, we never give a pass to authorities or to parties to the conflicts about their obligations under IHL. But we focus on the principle of humanitarian access and helping people in harm's way. Connecting now to the question of accountability and prosecution, and I think this is an important one because very often in situations like the one playing out in Ukraine, what comes first in all the political narratives is, yes, this party is violating IHL or that party is violating IHL. ICRC's role, and these are the principles, is always about speaking truth to power and giving feedback to authorities, to parties to the conflict about their respect or lack thereof of IHL. It doesn't mean that we are the entity that will hold them accountable. History will, and there are special mechanisms that will. But for us, the purpose of our IHL dialogue is to influence behavior during conflict in order to alleviate suffering. And this has always to be clear that our work and all the information we are gathering on the ground is to convince the perpetrators to change behavior. It's not to give them, and this is why, by the way, the ICRC has an exemption to testify before the ICC and other courts, because if parties to the conflict know that ICRC delegates are now providing sensitive information that will kind of hit them back, we won't have humanitarian access. And maybe on the question of principle, let me give you a very concrete example, the evacuation of civilians in Aleppo. And that created a huge dilemma for the ICRC, not because we were compromising on a principle, but because when we knew that the only option to save close to 100,000 civilians was to facilitate their evacuation out of eastern Aleppo, and that a negotiation was brokered between the two parties to the conflict, there was a time where we realized that our modalities and preconditions were not really respected. Actually, it was not just only civilians, there were also fighters with their weapons. And here came the question, should we continue to facilitate this or not? And there is no book, there is no Geneva Convention, there is no guideline that can give us the answer to this. The only credible response is to listen to our people on the ground, to their guts, to the balancing act they need to make between taking a risk, because having in the midst of civilian population fighters with weapons and having the other party to the conflict also monitoring the evacuation is a real risk, versus the risk of letting them in and having more casualty. That is a decision that our head of delegation took, and that me as regional director back then, I supported. And I think with hindsight, it was the right decision, but it could have been turned totally differently. And for this, it's not a principle that we gave up. It's a working modality confronted to the realities of the field.
Now, again, I mean, all intervention point in the same direction, stressing the importance of the realities on the field. I would like just to comment also on what you had said earlier, Roland, which resonates to what we heard yesterday morning during the panel dedicated to engaging with the non-state armed actors, where many speakers insisted on translating our language, our principles into something which is to be understood by the people we are talking to. That's to say, localizing culturally our message and making it understood by those we are entering into a conversation with. Ambassador, about the strategic compact, please.
Yes, quick points. Your question probably derives from the same thing that humanitarian diplomacies, they walk hand in hand, and where this strategic compass and security and defense come in. I would say at this moment, when the European Union is one of the biggest donors in the world, and diplomacy also has at least 5 centuries of experience, then the EU defense and security is basically a newborn baby. So it's not even an old man in this marriage, but a newborn baby. In this strategic compass context, strategic compass will not say probably anything about humanitarian diplomacy, but the point is, I would like to defend strategic compass is about capabilities to back up the policy choices. So the whole point is that we would have tools in our hand to provide, to be there with the missions, to provide support, maybe to provide security, humanitarian activities or whatever. So it's very much about the capabilities. Military, but also non-military, hybrid civilian, I mean all of those things that EU want to be more active with in the world. And this goes hand in hand with this global ambition that EU has to play more. But it has to take more responsibility precisely with all the problems that go on everywhere. And so far, there are member states' capabilities, but not at EU level, so this is the first document in its kind. Of course, it's a tedious reading, it's 40 pages, but I think it is actually mental mind shift in European Union. About silos, one last comment. It's very important that at the moment we have even the Foreign Affairs Council meeting in different formats, development, defense, and foreign policy. Foreign policy and defense sometimes meet together. I've been dealing with for 15 years with foreign policy. I've never seen that our foreign ministers and development ministers actually sit in the same room. Mm-hmm. In lots of countries, they are the same people, but in our case and lots of other countries, they are not. And I think so. The silos, thinking in silos actually starts from all our capitals, and EU is mirroring that. And I'm sad that Stefano Sannino is no longer here, but I think that precisely what he's trying to do, the major reform in the European External Action Service, to create also the humanitarian, digital, climate, I mean, these new structures in the External Action Service in the heart of the EU foreign policy, dealing precisely with these more global issues, is to break these silos, and I think the OES is behind that.
Thank you very much. So the message is clear. We humanitarians don't need to be sleepless at night to read the strategic compass, and we might end up in a not so distant future in a situation, coming back to what Roland was presenting us, where indeed the EU is also seen as a belligerent in the situation that we are dealing with. We have to deal with from a humanitarian point of view. Alain Désir, the last question will be for you, and the last answer, hopefully, about politicization between or versus more presence of the member states.
Yes, but so I think, of course, we can see contradictions in terms, as you say, Jean-Louis, but in fact, we have to live in a world of contradiction. So I would rather say that first, we have to recognize that there is different roles for the states, EU member states, for example, or the UN system, and for the NGO and civil society. It doesn't mean that we don't speak together, that we are not in the same context, acting and trying to understand the specificity of the context, and that we don't have any kind of common grounds. I mean, we all refer to the international law, to the international humanitarian law, to the law of war, and so on. Second, I think that sometimes it's very important that as humanitarian organization, we recognize that the answer cannot be only through humanitarian assistance. And we spoke about Afghanistan, and we also made a very strong advocacy in front of the EU institutions, but also the US Congress, to say, well, you can increase assistance for avoiding famine and food insecurity, but if the economy is frozen, if the banking system doesn't work, if there is so many Afghan assets which are kept in US and European banks, then the markets and all the access to food and to money, and if the civil servants are not paid, nothing will function in the country. And so sometimes we also have to explain that to fulfill our humanitarian mission, we need the other actors, especially the states and the international community, to play their own role. That's why in a report that we have published at the end of last year about the 20 main crises at risk of increasing this year, we spoke about system failure. I mean, we are facing in these 20 countries, which represent 10% of the world population, but 80% of the needs of the displaced, of the refugee people, and so on. You are facing a state failure, a diplomatic failure, a legal failure, an operational failure. So it means we have also to speak with the other actors to say, come on, take your parts to the response. And that you ask us about proposals, why, for example, on the violation of international humanitarian law, we very much welcome this idea of the European Union to have a mechanism for monitoring international humanitarian law. And we have a similar proposal to have an organization for the protection of humanitarian access. Because sometimes we, as humanitarian organization, we cannot do the gathering of proof. We cannot, we are not a tribunal. We can denounce, we can sometimes raise the issue, but it has to be a specific bodies which will be recognized by the UN, which will report in front of the Security Council, but if it doesn't work, in front of the UN General Assembly, to say, here there is violation of the law, the international law that you yourself are in charge of implementing, and this is something which is stopping the humanitarian assistance to be delivered. So we have to work together, but in the recognition of the specific role of each other. Doesn't mean that we don't have to ask each other about what we do and about what we should do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, my apologies to those who are waiting to invade this room for the next session, which is supposed to take place here. We are late, and I take full blame and responsibility for that purpose. But I'm really under the impression of the quality of the panel and of the conversation and the discussion that we've had together this afternoon. So I don't want to delay any further the end of this session. I know that I had promised to come back to you listening to your recommendation, but many of you, all of you, were kind enough to end up your first presentation by making this recommendation, and I'm sure that due note was taken from this recommendation. So my words of thanks to you, really, to the panels, to the panelists, to the ministers who join us. Stefano is not with us, but certainly our thanks will be conveyed to him. My warm thanks to the technical team who has supported this event as throughout the forum. My thanks to the interpreters, of course, not forgetting their help and support. And my special personal thanks to my wonderful coach, Christian Berman from ECHO, who was totally instrumental in helping me to moderate and prepare this session. I wish you a very nice end of the forum. I wish you a very pleasant and fruitful afternoon. And probably we'll meet again sometimes next year in Brussels. Thank you, goodbye.